Hi everyone. We've already touched quite a bit on Khashoggi and the recent incident, how we deem or view Saudi and the UAE as potential allies in the United States, and that's what I'd like to focus on. One of my impressions of the Khashoggi case is, why did Saudi feel that it was okay to commit such an overt act, and potentially with the assistance of the United Arab Emirates? And this could come down, in fact, to a recent incident that has been publicised quite well so far, of an act of piracy against a US yacht in international waters. And that is a case that happened on the 4th of March this year. A princess of Dubai, a daughter of the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Latifa, decided that she wanted to escape what she described as torture and abuse that she had suffered at the hands of her father for years. She enlisted the assistance of a US citizen to leave the country. He hired a yacht, or purchased a yacht actually, and went to the coast of Oman, where he met her to assist her to leave the country. Now, he didn't enter their waters. He was on a US flagged yacht headed to India with the assistance of a Finnish woman who was a friend of the princess and 3 Filipino yacht crew. Approaching India, having committed no crime whatsoever, 5 military warships approached, attacked, commandeered and assaulted those on board. Following the assault, the passengers on board were taken back to the UAE against their will and without communication. We were notified of the incident, and we contacted the Indian Coast Guard and the US Coast Guard and received no response. 2 weeks later, we still hadn't heard anything, and these people had been brought back to the UAE against their will with the US flagged yacht. They were kept there for 2 weeks. During this time, we reported it to all of the appropriate crime agencies and the FBI, who have opened an investigation. In that time, the American citizen and others were kept in solitary confinement. They were forced to make confessions against their will on video. They were told that they would be chopped into little pieces and discarded in the desert. It was only once we raised it to the international press and that the case was actually published, did the UAE finally release these people. The American citizen was placed back on his yacht from the UAE and allowed to leave. Now, during this time, obviously, we had great concerns that his yacht would be sunk because the UAE had shown such a disregard for international law, for protocols, for the United Nations Convention against torture and human rights violations. We had every reason to believe that these people would be attacked again at sea, perhaps disappeared again, but this time with a better excuse. Now, I think that the attack on this yacht was ill thought through, that the UAE thought that they could get away with it, that the UAE felt that the US would not care about an attack on their yacht. And when I talk about an attack on the yacht, I am talking a very violent attack that has caused the American citizen to have to have CAT scans and ongoing treatment where he remains in the UK at this time. There were bodies piled up on each other on the yacht, and serious head injuries to unarmed passengers. And in this attack, the UAE actually enlisted the assistance of our ally, India. Reportedly over a telephone call between Sheikh Mohammed and Modi, it was done as a favour. Now, India has not responded to requests for information on their involvement in the attack. However, their intelligence department has said that they confirmed that they did assist and that it was in the interests of India to support their allies, the UAE. However, in attacking a US yacht without even discussing it with the US, without contacting the FBI or their agents in America for permission to board this yacht, they disregarded their alliance with the US in favour of an alliance with the UAE. In return for this favour, we can see quite blatantly that the UAE has agreed to several extraditions to India that had been on hold within days of this attack, these extraditions were approved. The Federal Bureau of Investigation in Florida has opened this case, and we have spent a substantial amount of time with them, providing them evidence of the attack. The issue here is that if the UAE is allowed to commit such rogue acts against the US, how can they actually be considered an ally? Further, if the United States does not issue some sort of discipline against them, this sort of behavior is going to escalate, and we are potentially going to see another Khashoggi from the UAE. It's very important, as George touched on earlier, to set boundaries, whether they're children or allies. Now, what we can see, furthermore, is that the UAE doesn't stop with an attack like this. This is just an extreme example of what we have seen over the past 10 years. In another case, Sheikh Latifa's sister was kidnapped from British soil in England off the streets. Kidnapping investigation was opened, but she was commandeered. She was taken illegally on a plane to France and back to the UAE and has not been heard of since. I think we haven't seen the government of the United States or the United Kingdom stand up to the United Arab Emirates and tell them that this is not okay. And the same goes for Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations. We're seeing a consistent abuse of our citizens in many different ways, and we're seeing an increase of influence into politics and media in both the United Kingdom, the United States, and our allies. Over the past 10 years, we have dealt with in excess of 10,000 cases, mostly of foreign nationals who have been legally abused, subject to human rights violations, torture, forced confessions, arbitrary detentions. And we have even seen a death in custody, allegedly due to, and with 3 witnesses, due to police brutality. When the United Kingdom courts requested the CCTV to rule out this behaviour, the UAE denied that request, and yet we continued with our alliance. The same can be said for America, where we have seen a number of citizens forcibly detained in the UAE, and the US has turned a blind eye very much to this. They have not got involved when we have raised these situations to the embassies. They say that we cannot get involved in a foreign legal system. Well, we can, and we do, and we have now seen the United Kingdom stand up for Matthew Hedges, who you might have heard of. He is a British academic who went to conduct some research and was accused of espionage. And this isn't the first case where we've seen a foreign national accused of espionage simply for asking questions, for reporting something that the government might consider sensitive or defamatory. In many cases, there have been complete misunderstandings. We've seen hobbyists who take photos of aeroplanes for aviation interests, and they've been accused again of spying. And in all of these cases, they have been detained without charge, without evidence, simply because someone has pointed the finger, and that is enough to hold them. In the case of the plane spotters, they were released 5 months later after solitary confinement, but only once the international press spotlit the issue. And that's what we see with the UAE. They market themselves as a modern society, quite similar in culture to our own, where alcohol is poured freely, where people club and shop, and it's almost seen as the Vegas or Bangkok of the Middle East, and that anything goes, which is absolutely not the case. Any one of us right now, if we enter Dubai, would 100% be in violation of one of their laws there. And it would only be out of sheer luck that you weren't arrested, that you weren't charged, and that you weren't sent to solitary confinement. Even being here at this very conference would be considered potentially an arrestable offence, very similar to the case of Matthew Hedges, simply for talking about these issues, because there is no freedom of press, there is no freedom of speech. And this doesn't just extend to foreign nationals, it extends to their own citizens too, where Emiratis themselves, human rights activists and lawyers, politicians, anyone who wants to see change in the legal system, improvement, an end to corruption, Any of these reasons is enough to jail someone for life. And we've seen that recently in the case of Ahmed Mansour, who was a prominent human rights activist. He's been sentenced to in excess of 7 years in prison. He's been constantly harassed by the government, and we've also seen people be threatened that they could be jailed for talking about bad weather or a plane crash, a plane incident, because it's defamatory to the government. It doesn't promote their airline in a good light. So even retweeting an existing news story, let's say that the Khashoggi case had implications that the UAE was involved, and you retweeted a story from CNN, that's a crime in the UAE. And the US government is not doing enough to warn citizens or to pressure the UAE to make changes to make people safe. We have an increasing amount of publicity and marketing from the governments themselves. They very much act as businesses. We have an increasing amount of marketing to the US to invest in the Emirates, to invest in business, to invest in offshore structures, in free trade zones. But it is almost inevitable that any business person who invests there will either have their company stolen from them, the cash stolen, be wrongfully accused of a crime such as embezzlement, even if they had nothing to do with it and there's no evidence. The local partner, or perhaps some member of the authorities, has actually taken the money out. But because there is no burden of proof, no evidence required, that person is going to end up either convicted and sentenced, or if they're lucky enough to have left the country before these charges escalated, then they will have simply lost their money. And I can cite many cases of this. This is something I've been dealing with personally for 10 years. We have people in the room here who have suffered this very situation, and it is ongoing. I don't think that it's productive for US and UK interests to have governments of different emirates in the UAE actually promoting to the US citizens without warning from the US government as to the risks. And that's something that I have been lobbying the Western governments to increase their travel warnings, their investment warnings, because it is prevalent, it's constant. We have the case of a British national who invested 250 million into a company in the UAE. And he grew and developed it to the point where it was worth 500 million. He had a local partner, and they decided that they would like the full 500 million. So they used Baker McKenzie law firm, the CEO of which is Mr. Sorry, I forget that for the moment, but Habib al-Mullah. He's also the head of the DIFC, which is the International Arbitration Centre, actually, in the UAE. Now, to facilitate this theft of a business from a foreign national, he acted as a lawyer and represented his client who wanted to steal the money, but also fabricated to the court a power of attorney to represent the other client, the victim. He turned up to court, stood over here for the defense, and stood over here to the prosecution. In 21 cases, the judge sat at the front and he said, "Do you have a power of attorney?" "Oh yes, I have a power of attorney." "Can I see it?" "Not really, no." And the judge still allowed it to go ahead. Why? Because Habib al-Mullah is the right-hand man. He is friends with the ruler of Dubai, and he yields a lot of influence. There's something in the UAE called wasta, and that means the ability to influence locally within politics, within the judicial system, and he was able to get away with this. So he stole this person's entire business and then put him on the Interpol database. Now, Interpol is probably one of the most spotlit issues in the Middle East at the moment. That's Saudi, that's Qatar, that's the UAE. We talk about investing 20 million into lobby groups in the US. What we don't talk about so much is the fact that the UAE has donated 50 million to Interpol. Interpol is a crime organization that is glorified in movies that we respect. We think that they are there to assist us and to prevent terrorism. but it seems they're for sale. Yes, 50 million to Interpol, and that represents 50% of the donations that Interpol received. 50%, and the other 50% of the donations were made up of the other 180 member countries. So we're talking complete ownership, really, of the Interpol crime organization. Another 10 million came in from Qatar. Now, with this rising contribution to Interpol, we are seeing a rising number of Interpol abuse cases. And when I say Interpol abuse, this is usually stemming from Gulf nations, or as has been reported, China, Russia, Egypt, for the purpose of reporting bloggers and journalists, people with opposing views to the government. However, in the Gulf region, it goes a little bit further. It's used by the private sector. So we see banks like HSBC, and I just received a client a few days ago. He's been arrested in some Ukraine, and he's complaining about the prison conditions. But he's been arrested in the Ukraine on the basis of a fake, false Interpol report from the UAE, from HSBC, ultimately for an alleged debt of 25,000 euros. 25,000 euros of which he'd paid 10 years ago. So it's banks abusing the system because they can. We have so many cases at the moment of banks literally 15,000, 30,000 debts, and people are getting arrested. They're getting detained for 6 weeks. They're undergoing extradition proceedings. We have someone in Mallorca right now. We had several in Germany, Italy, and other European countries last year. Ultimately, the ones that are related to bank debt, they are removed, and they're removed not so promptly. It can take up to 9 months. Interpol's not a fast processor. So during that time, they're facing extradition proceedings. They're usually losing their employment and suffering extortionate legal fees, really, to defend against an extradition. Aside from that, we're seeing commercial relationships where business investors and partners are looking to extort each other, or where a local partner usually is looking to extort another party. They put them on Interpol and they say, give me money and I'll remove the report. So this is just how insane Interpol is going. Al Jazeera has done some serious investigative reports, but we're not seeing any change. I talk to Interpol all the time. They read my articles all the time about this Interpol abuse. They know it's going on, but they seem incapable of doing anything about it, and currently they're immune to any legal action against them. So this Interpol and extradition abuse needs to stop. We have a number of American citizens on Interpol at the moment, and America isn't even taking them seriously. If I enter a border in America and I'm on Interpol, authorities simply notify you and say, you seem to have a problem with the UAE, but don't worry about it, and they let you in. So this is, I mean, the Interpol organization has lost so much credibility. However, it shows just what the UAE can do to American citizens, how they can abuse them. And it's something that I think that the US really needs to keep a close eye on. I don't think that we should be allowing Interpol to have so much power if it's being sold to the Middle East, if it's being sold to Qatar and the UAE primarily. I think we would have to reduce the amount of dependency that we have on the organization. Previously, they were sponsored by Philip Morris in the private sector, but that became controversial, so now they're taking cash from Middle Eastern countries. What else? Yes. I mean, the corruption in the UAE has been a problem for a long time, and so much so that the UAE actually instructed a German organisation to assist them in anti-corruption, but it turns out that that was just for media. And as soon as the media reported that they were doing something about corruption, they withdrew the organisation from their charter. So the UAE is currently marketing heavily to tourists, heavily to investors, luring them in, and then arresting them, forcing them to confess, arbitrarily detaining them, subjecting them to human rights violations and torture. There have been several torture cases against the UAE, one of them settled in America, and we have several open investigations at the United Nations. Now, the United Nations the UAE is a signatory to the United Nations, but they are currently ignoring all requests from the UN, and that includes responding to this attack on the US yacht. It includes torture allegations. Meanwhile, the UAE is promoting itself as a modern and tolerant destination, a country that preserves women's rights and anti-discrimination. Yet it's a country that the UK courts have absolutely refused to extradite anyone to based on the real risk of torture, human rights violations, discrimination and crimes against women. Now clearly, when we talk about the Latifa case and her disappearance from the US yacht, this came down to the UAE imposing their view of Sharia law. When the US citizen was in detention for those 2 weeks before he was finally released, he was told that he had not violated any Emirates laws, that he had violated Sharia law in that the 32-year-old princess was not married and thus was owned by her father, and that it violated Sharia law in that he helped her try to escape her father. Now, to me, that says that the UAE is willing to act upon Sharia law against a US yacht. If this act was done by a private individual, then it would be considered a jihadist act of war against America. Just because it was done by allies of America doesn't mean that it should be taken any less seriously. The UAE and Saudi need to be constantly addressed and constantly kept into line. They're investing too much money in the West and creating too much influence to the point where Saudi and the UAE were even able to influence Rex Tillerson's dismissal. He was opposing an invasion to Qatar, and very quickly after he was dismissed. Saudi and the UAE apparently knew about his dismissal before the rest of the world did, and that to me shows how much influence they have on US politics. Thank you, I think that's sufficient.